On Thursday morning, August 18, 1977, Elena Mercer drove a hand auger into a scar of wet clay on the dry harrow lease in Flint County, Kansas, while 12 buffalo crowded the fence behind her. County Conservation Officer Douglas Crane watched brown water climb the bore and said, "That seep won't hold through September." The Flint County groundwater map agreed with Douglas Crane. The page showed the failed pond, the shallow draw below it, 2 dry test holes drilled before the Second World War, and a contour line bending east toward Morrow Bend. It showed no spring beneath the pond, no reliable aquifer within reach of a hand auger, and no reason for brown water to be standing in Elena Mercer's bore on the driest lease in that part of the county. That was why Douglas kept his steel-cased flow stopwatch clipped to his belt. Water that appeared once proved very little. Water that could be measured after the ground had gone hard was something else. It was 1971, and Elena Mercer was repairing fence on the 74-acre home farm outside Morrow Bend. She was 29 then, wiry and broad-shouldered, with fair pink skin and chestnut-brown hair tied low behind her collar with a plain cord. Thin silver wire-rim glasses sat over gray-green eyes, and freckles crossed the bridge of her narrow, straight nose. She wore the same faded olive canvas work shirt she would still be wearing 6 years later, though at the time its elbows had not yet been patched, and a black oilcloth notebook rode in the shirt pocket even when there was nothing in it but fence measurements and the price of staples. The west fence leaned toward the county road in a slow, tired curve. Elena had already replaced 3 hedge posts, but the 4th would not stand straight because the hole had widened beneath the frost line. She tamped broken limestone around it, sighted down the wire, and reached for the spade again. Frances Mercer came across the pasture carrying a brass plumb bob. Frances was 55 in 1971, compact and sturdy, with iron-gray hair braided and pinned into a low coil. She wore a blue chambray blouse beneath a brown herringbone cardigan, a charcoal wool skirt, and black leather farm shoes that collected dust without ever seeming untidy. Her dark tortoiseshell reading glasses were folded into one hand. The plumb bob hung from the other. She tied the brass weight to the top staple, waited for it to stop swinging, and looked at the string. 2 inches out. The wire will pull it east. The wire pulls until winter, the ground stays. Elena lifted the post, reset the limestone, and tamped it again. Frances checked it a second time. The brass point settled over the center of the post hole. "Count what stays, not what shines," she said. That line had begun during the lean years after Frances took over the farm accounts. A new gate shone, a painted tractor shone, a kitchen appliance in a dealer window shone, soil depth stayed, fence corners stayed. A repaired transmission stayed if the repair had been done correctly. Frances never objected to buying a useful thing, but usefulness had to remain after the salesman left and the first payment came due. By 1977, Elena was 35 and supporting her 18-year-old daughter, Ruth, on those same 74 acres. Ruth was slim, with fair skin, copper-red hair held away from her face by a navy cloth band, and hazel eyes behind oval amber-framed glasses. A dense scatter of freckles crossed both cheeks. She had finished school, taken bookkeeping work 3 afternoons a week at Morrow Bend Grain, and made it plain that her wages belonged in the household account until the farm could carry itself. The farm was carrying very little. 38 acres were planted to wheat under a crop share arrangement. 11 acres held brome hay. 9 acres remained in native grass, and the rest disappeared beneath the house, barn, windbreak, lanes, garden, creek bank, and a machine shed whose roof still leaked over the drill press. After seed, fuel, taxes, repairs, and the crop share division, the wheat had cleared $1,986 the previous year. Hay sales had added $642. Ruth's wages covered groceries and electricity more often than anyone admitted. The 12 American bison were Elena's attempt to build something the 74 acres could not support by themselves. They were not pets, curiosities, or a roadside attraction. They were breeding animals chosen because they used rough forage well, tolerated Kansas winters, and required less shelter than cattle. Elena had bought the first 5 females over 3 years, paying cash each time. The remaining animals came from retained calves and 1 traded bull. The herd represented 6 years of restraint. It also represented more grass than the Mercer farm possessed. Let me tell you about Frances Mercer, because the numbers on that kitchen table began with the way she inspected what other people ignored. Frances did not teach Elena to chase bargains. Cheap things could be expensive if they failed under load, and free things could consume a farm one repair at a time. She taught her to ask what work had already gone into an object before somebody discarded it. A bent gate had been cut, welded, galvanized, and proven against livestock before a truck backed into it. A cracked stone trough had survived 50 winters before one corner opened. A worn cultivator sweep still contained shaped, hardened steel. Most people see a worn thing and they see the wear. Frances saw the work that remained inside it. She carried the brass plumb bob because a post could look straight against rolling ground and still be leaning badly enough to loosen every wire attached to it. She read invoices from the bottom upward because totals were where errors like to hide. When Alina proposed anything that cost more than $20, Frances asked what stayed after the money left. The answer came walking up the lane in March of 1977. Leon Harrow owned the adjoining 160-acre back pasture. He was 67, lean and long-limbed with weathered skin, white hair brushed straight back, rimless spectacles, and a close white chin beard. A brass leasebox key hung from his belt by a short chain. He stood slightly forward at the waist, not from weakness but from a lifetime of walking into wind, and his broad steps carried him from the Mercer yard gate to the kitchen porch without hurry. He had tried to lease the pasture twice. The first cattleman hauled his stock out after 6 weeks because the pond leaked faster than spring rain could fill it. The second installed a windmill over an old bore near the north fence, only to discover that the hole had never reached water. The tower remained, silver and useless, turning above a capped pipe. Leon wanted $1,200 a year. For grass nobody can water, Frances said. For 160 acres behind a 5-wire fence, Leon replied. 4 wires are sound. 4.5. Frances looked toward the back pasture. The pond lay beyond the ridge, but the windmill wheel could be seen turning above the cottonwoods. Leon had no plan to repair the pond. The clay lining had cracked through 2 dry summers and the downhill shoulder had slumped. Rebuilding it would require a crawler tractor, hauled clay, and enough rain to seal the new basin. The windmill offered no better answer. 3 men had opened the bore, dropped a weighted line through 140 feet of casing, and brought it back dry. That was why the lease remained available at $7.50 per acre when sound Flint County pasture rented for nearly twice that. Without water, cattle could not use the forage reliably. Anyone leasing it would have to haul water, and hauled water converted cheap grass into expensive grass 1 axle mile at a time. Alina asked Leon for the lease form. He took it from the inside pocket of his bib overalls and set it on the porch rail. "You'll read the water clause." "I'll read all of it." Leon watched her tuck the folded paper behind the black notebook in her shirt pocket. "The offer stands until planting." Alina spent the next 11 evenings at the kitchen table. She calculated fence repair by post, staple, and roll. She measured the route from the Mercer hydrant to the Harrow tank and counted the turns where a 500-gallon wagon would pull hard against the tractor drawbar. She priced an earth auger, gravel, couplings, and a used galvanized tank, though there was not yet any water to put through the couplings or into the tank. Frances did not ask why. She watched Alina sharpen a pencil with a paring knife, turn to a clean page, and write Leon Harrow's name at the top. On April 14th, Alina placed the Harrow lease and her handwritten figures on Frances Mercer's kitchen table. The lease lay on the left. The black oilcloth notebook lay open in the center. On the right, Alina placed 1 envelope containing the farm's available cash. Frances adjusted her tortoiseshell reading glasses, pulled the notebook closer, and began with the first line. The annual lease was $1,200, payable in 2 installments. $600 would be due when the papers were signed. The remaining $600 would be due after wheat harvest. Used fencing came to $312. Alina had found 4 rolls of serviceable woven wire behind a dismantled sheep yard near Clay Junction, along with 36 steel posts and 2 corner braces. The wire was weathered but not rusted through. She had tested each roll by bending the lower strand back on itself. None cracked. A used hand auger from a farm sale would cost $18. A long-handled round-point shovel at the same sale would cost $4. Washed 3/4-inch gravel from Morrow Bend Sand and Feed would cost $34.50, delivered in a single small load. 6 drainage couplings would cost $9.60. A dented but watertight galvanized stock tank would cost $28. The black oilcloth notebook had cost 75 cents, and Alina included it because Francis did not allow tools to vanish from an account merely because they fit in a pocket. Francis touched the pencil point to the next line. 96 feet of perforated pipe, no charge, rejected drainage stock. Why rejected? Cracked bell ends. Cracked pipe carries no water. It won't carry pressure. It will collect seepage through the perforations. Francis looked over the top of her glasses. From where? I haven't found that yet. That answer remained between them while the kitchen clock ticked through 11 seconds. Alina had located the pipe behind Flint Tile Works. The plant made clay field tile and assembled drainage supplies for contractors who laid farm lines across 3 counties. 4-inch perforated PVC arrived in nested bundles. Each 20-foot section formed with a widened bell at one end so the next section could seat inside it. A forklift operator had dropped part of a shipment against the loading dock. The impact split or chipped the bells on 7 sections. The damage made the pieces useless as pressure-rated stock. A contractor could not certify them, a dealer could not sell them as intact drainage lengths, and the plant could not return a partial damaged bundle. Yet the straight portions remained sound. Their walls had not collapsed, the perforation rows were clean, and the plastic had never spent a day underground. Flint Tile Works paid 12 cents per foot to have rejected plastic hauled away with broken pallets and wrapping. The plant manager told Alina she could take 96 usable feet if she cut off the cracked bells herself, and signed a receipt showing the material had been removed as scrap. Giving it away saved the plant $11.52 in disposal charges. Alina would spend nothing but fuel to bring it home in the wheat truck, and she had already included that fuel in the April farm allowance. Francis returned to the figures. The lease, used fencing, hand auger, shovel, gravel, couplings, tank, and notebook totaled $1,606.85. The free drainage pipe changed no number on the page, but without it, Alina's proposed water collection system did not exist. Francis added the figures in the margin. She reached $1,606.85. Then she added them again in a different order. She reached the same total. How do you water 12 bison? 500 gallons at a trip until I find a better way. How many trips? In cool weather, 2 every 3 days, in heat, 1 a day, possibly more. Distance, 3.8 miles from our hydrant to the tank and back. Tractor hours, 43 minutes if the lane is dry. If it rains, the pasture has water. If it rains enough. Alina nodded. Francis turned to a page farther back. There Alina had calculated the cost of hauling water for 120 days. Fuel, oil, tire wear, drawbar time, tank filling, and the value of her own labor did not make the lease cheap. Even without wages assigned to Alina, the water hauling could consume $437 before autumn. The grass still made the figures possible. The back pasture carried little brush, and Leon had rested it for nearly a year after the second lessee removed his cattle. If Alina divided it into 3 grazing blocks, the 12 bison could use the taller western grass first, move east as the warm season stands developed, and return only after the first section recovered. But all 3 blocks depended on water. Francis closed the notebook halfway. What is the alternative? Alina took an estimate from the envelope. The quote came from Prairie Deep Well and Pump. The company would drill to 220 feet, set casing, install a submersible pump, trench an electrical line, and guarantee only that it would complete the hole. The quoted total was $8,640. If the bore came in dry, mobilization and drilling charges would still be due. Prairie Deep Well wanted 1/3 before moving the rig. Alina could not pay it. The Morrow Bend Bank would lend against the 74-acre home farm, but only if Francis signed the mortgage with her. The farm had no existing land debt. Francis had spent 16 years clearing the last note, first with wheat checks, then with egg money, and finally by selling a narrow strip along the county road to the Rural Electric Cooperative. Alina had already decided she would not put those acres behind a drilling loan. The farm is not for sale, she said. Francis did not correct her. It was not being offered for sale, but both women understood what a mortgage could become when weather and prices turned together. Francis opened the notebook again and read the pipe measurements, the grazing estimates, and the proposed cash schedule. She rubbed one thumb across the pencil indentation on the page. The pressure of Alina's writing had marked the sheet beneath it. You have $600 for Leon. Yes, you have $312 for fence. After the wheat payment, you don't have the rest. I can sell the spare hay rake. You use it for parts. I've taken every part I need. Francis removed her glasses. I need to think about it. That was all she said. Alina gathered the lease, but Frances placed one hand on the notebook. Leave this. For the next 3 days, the notebook remained beside Frances's place at the kitchen table. She checked the grazing calculations against the feed bills. She walked the Mercer fence adjoining Harrow's pasture and counted every failed post herself. She measured the galvanized tank Leon had left beside the barn and found that Alina's estimate for a replacement was justified. The old tank leaked through 5 pinholes and a split seam. On the second evening, Alina came in after dark and found the $8,640 well quote lying beside the black notebook. Frances had underlined the clause that required payment even if the hole proved dry. Neither woman mentioned it. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The wheat stood green, Leon's grass was coming early, and the household account held enough to make the first lease payment. That didn't last. A gearbox tooth broke on the drill, the veterinary bill arrived 2 weeks sooner than expected, and wheat prices slipped 9 cents before Alina could contract the crop. The available margin narrowed by $68. Alina removed a new gate from her figures, planned to rebuild one from the bent Southlot gate, and changed nothing else. On the morning of April 17th, Frances stood beside the sink with the brass plumb bob hanging from her belt loop. The black notebook rested on the counter. She had inserted a narrow slip of paper between the pages, listing the 74 acres as the only asset that could not be risked. Alina came in carrying an empty milk pail. Frances held out the notebook. 3 days later, Frances returned the notebook and said, "Lease it, but don't borrow." Alina nodded once. "Not against the house, not against the wheat ground, and not against equipment you need to make the lease work. I won't. If the grass fails, you leave. Yes. If the water costs more than the grass saves, you leave. Yes." Frances released the notebook. Alina signed Leon Harrow's lease that afternoon at his kitchen table. Leon placed the brass leasebox key beside his right hand and followed each line with one square fingertip. He did not hurry her through the document. The 160 acres had disappointed 2 men already, and he had no interest in pretending it had not. The water clause appeared halfway down the second page. No credit for water improvements. It meant that any tank, line, pond repair, spring box, casing, trough, or pumping equipment Alina added would not reduce the rent. It also meant Leon owed her nothing if the lease ended. An improvement attached to his land became part of his land unless she removed it before surrendering possession. Leon watched her read the sentence twice. "That clause bothers people. It should. I won't pay for a well. I'm not drilling one. You'll haul water, for now." Leon pushed a fountain pen across the table. Alina signed her full name, wrote the date as April 14, 1977 beneath it, and counted $600 into Leon's hand. He folded the bills without recounting them. "Anything else? I'll need a receipt." Leon's eyebrows rose behind his rimless spectacles, but he opened a drawer and removed a receipt book. By the end of April, Alina had repaired the perimeter fence. She set the used steel posts at 10-foot intervals where the woven wire needed support, reused hedge posts on the corners, and rebuilt the east gate from 2 bent frames cut apart and joined with bolted straps. The work consumed the entire $312 allowed for fencing, including staples, brace wire, bolts, and the fuel used to collect the materials. She entered each amount in the black notebook. The 12 bison entered the Harrow pasture on May 2nd. For the first week, they stayed on the western rise where the little bluestem and switchgrass stood above their knees. Alina hauled 500 gallons every morning in a steel wagon tank pulled behind the tractor. She filled the galvanized stock tank near the center fence, waited while the herd drank, and checked every fitting before returning home. One trip used 1.3 gallons of tractor fuel when the lane was dry. The round journey took 43 minutes. Filling and draining added 26 minutes. If one animal stood in the gate, it took longer. Alina recorded the date, departure time, return time, estimated gallons delivered, fuel used, air temperature, and condition of the lane. She also recorded how far the tank level fell between visits. A bison did not drink the same amount every day. Temperature, forage moisture, lactation, wind, and the distance traveled between grass and tank all changed demand. Alina did not need a perfect number. She needed to know whether hauling remained cheaper than feeding the herd at home. Let me tell you about buffalo wallows, because a wallow is not random destruction when 12 animals keep choosing the same 6 yards of ground. A full-grown bison makes a wallow by dropping to its knees, lowering one shoulder and rolling its weight into bare soil. The animal twists across its back, grinds the base of its horns along the surface, and rises under a coat of dust or mud. Others return to the same depression because the vegetation is already broken, the ground is exposed, and the basin holds cooler soil beneath the surface. On dry upland, a wallow becomes a shallow bowl of powdered earth. In wet ground, repeated rolling smears clay, presses water upward, and enlarges the hollow one shoulder width at a time. The Harrow herd made 7 wallows during May and June. 6 dried within a day after rain. The 7th sat below the failed pond, near the point where the slope eased into a narrow draw. Alina first marked it because the animals used it out of sequence. They would graze the western rise, cross nearly half a mile of grass, drink at the galvanized tank, and return to that low patch before moving back uphill. On hot afternoons, the bull stood over the depression while the females waited. After he rolled, dark mud clung to the hair behind his forelegs. There had been no rain for 9 days. Alina walked into the wallow after the herd moved away. The center looked dry, but her boot heel broke through a crust thinner than a pie shell. The soil beneath was cool. When she pressed her thumb into it, blue-gray clay darkened around the print. The pond bed 20 yards uphill had dried into pale plates. Cracks opened wide enough to accept the handle of her pliers. The wallow should have been drier than the pond because its depression was shallower and exposed to hooves, sun, and wind. It was not. Alina pushed a willow switch into the wallow and tied a strip of white cloth at the top. She added the location to the notebook by measuring from the south fence corner and the dead cottonwood at the draw. During the next water haul, she checked the cloth. The wallow remained damp. Ruth noticed the repeated measurements when Alina left the notebook open beside the kitchen sink. She did not ask whether her mother had found water. Instead, she took an unused green cloth-bound ledger from the grain office's discard cabinet, wrote Mercer Pasture savings across the first page, and began entering costs that had not been paid. The first entry was for the rebuilt East Gate. A new livestock gate of the same width cost $46.20. Alina's bolts and straps had cost $6.80. Ruth entered $39.40 as value retained. The second entry covered used fencing against new wire. The third covered each water trip Alina avoided after a cool night or a light rain. Ruth calculated fuel first, then added the maintenance allowance Alina had assigned to tractor hours. She did not count Alina's labor because Alina had not assigned it a cash value in the notebook. Within 3 weeks, the green ledger showed $83.16 in avoided dealer costs and reduced hauling expense. Frances found it beneath Ruth's arm one evening while the 3 women stood at the kitchen counter. "Who asked you to keep that?" "No one." "Why keep it?" Ruth adjusted her amber-framed glasses. "Because saved money disappears if nobody gives it a line." Frances looked at Alina. "Count what stays." Alina glanced toward the black notebook in her shirt pocket. "Not what shines." Ruth carried the green ledger from then on. She stood with one shoulder slightly forward as she wrote, and her quick, compact steps carried her between the wagon tank, the tractor gauge, and the kitchen table before Alina had finished putting away the tools. July brought 2 small storms and 1 week of heat. The 6 upland wallows changed from dust to mud and back to dust. The low wallow remained cool beneath its crust. Alina began recording the clay on the animals themselves. Dark smears appeared on the lower legs of 9 bison after they used the depression. The color matched no surface soil in the pond bed. She collected a thumb-sized sample, rolled it between her palms, and found that it held a ribbon before breaking. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The wagon axle stayed tight, the bison gained weight, and the lease grass held longer than Alina's grazing table had predicted. That didn't last. By early August, the pond bed was white at the edges, the grass along the draw curled inward, and each water trip left the galvanized tank empty before the next morning. Alina began hauling twice on the hottest days. The green ledger stopped growing. The black notebook filled faster. Still, the low wallow darkened each evening after the herd crossed it. On August 17th, Alina watched the last animal leave the stock tank and turn away from green grass. The bull led the herd toward the failed pond. 11 others followed, crossed the powder-dry basin, and lowered their heads over the same depression. By August 17th, all 12 buffalo were digging at the same low patch below the failed pond. Alina waited until they moved upslope, then stretched temporary wire around the wallow. She used 6 steel posts, 3 strands of smooth wire, and strips of white cloth tied where the animals could see them. The enclosure was not strong enough to hold a determined bull, but it redirected the herd toward the adjoining grass while she worked. She removed the upper soil with the $4 shovel. The first 2 inches were churned silt mixed with hair, dried manure, and broken grass roots. Below that lay puddled clay pressed smooth by the weight of the animals. The shovel blade peeled it away in dense slabs. At 7 inches, the clay changed color. The upper layer was brown and mottled. The lower layer was blue-gray, fine enough to coat the shovel with a continuous skin. It carried almost no gravel. When Alina squeezed a handful, water did not drip from it, but the clay kept the shape of her fingers. Beneath the blue-gray cap, the shovel struck damp, fine sand. Alina stopped. She cleaned the edge of the cut with the blade and pressed 2 fingers into the exposed band. The sand felt cool and loose. Tiny grains adhered to her skin, but the material would not form a ribbon the way the clay had. She covered the opening with a square of sheet metal, weighted it with a fence post, and drove home. The groundwater manual lay on a shelf above the drill press in the machine shed. Alina had bought it for 25 cents at a farm auction 4 years earlier. It came from a vocational agriculture classroom closed during a district consolidation. The cover was stained with lamp oil, 6 pages had pulled loose from the binding, and somebody had drawn a mustache on the photograph of a pump installer. The useful chapters remained intact. Let me tell you about that discarded groundwater manual, because Alina did not open it looking for a spring. She had bought it for the diagrams of shallow wells, foot valves, pipe screens, and pump cylinders, figuring that a quarter was less than 1 service call. Yet one chapter described water that never reached the deep regional aquifer shown on county maps. Perched water forms when rain enters permeable ground and meets a layer that transmits water much more slowly. Sand accepts infiltration through connected pore spaces. Dense clay does not stop water completely, but its tiny pores restrict movement enough that water can accumulate above it. If the clay layer slopes, the water moves laterally through the sand rather than continuing downward. That alone does not make a spring. A spring appears where the water-bearing layer intersects the land's surface, or where pressure pushes water through a break in the confining material. The elevation of the recharge area matters. So does the continuity of the sand. A wet pocket sealed inside clay can remain damp for weeks and still contain no continuing supply. A sand lens receiving water from higher ground behaves differently because each gallon leaving the outlet can be replaced from upslope storage. The manual called the difference hydraulic head. Alina read that chapter until the machine shed went dark around her. She took the book inside, placed it beside her plate, and copied 3 diagrams into the black notebook. One showed a sand seam lying over clay. Another showed rain entering on a ridge and moving sideways above the confining layer. The third showed a seep at the point where erosion cut across the sand. The harrow wallow lay below a ridge. It also lay above a draw that had cut through several feet of soil. Most people see a buffalo wallow and they see ruined grass. Frances sees a question the animals have already spent weeks answering. She said it the next morning while holding the brass plumb bob above Alina's first auger hole. Frances had come to the lease in her brown herringbone cardigan despite the heat. Her short, even steps carried her around the fenced wallow while Alina laid out 5 boring points in a cross. The center point sat 4 yards from the animal's deepest depression, outside the soil they had churned. 2 points ran upslope. 2 ran downslope toward the draw. Alina turned the hand auger into the first point. Each time the barrel filled, she lifted it, laid the soil in order on a strip of burlap and measured the depth. Brown silt continued to 14 inches. Mottled clay followed. Blue-gray clay appeared at 31 inches and remained until 39. At 39 inches, the auger teeth brought up wet sand. Alina entered the depth in the notebook. The second point, 12 feet upslope, reached sand at 44 inches. The third reached it at 51. Downslope, the fourth point found the clay cap thinning. The blue-gray layer ended at 38 inches. The fifth point, closer to the draw, passed through clay at 40 inches but brought up less sand, as though the lens narrowed there or had been cut by erosion. 5 holes did not prove a spring. They did reveal a layer with shape. Alina drew the ground surface as a sloping line across 2 notebook pages. Beneath it, she marked the depth of the clay-sand boundary at each bore. The sand lens dipped toward the draw. The shallowest cap was 38 inches. The wettest sample came from the point just upslope of the wallow. Frances watched Alina pinch sand between her fingers. Does the county map show it? No. Does the book say maps show everything? No. What does it say? Small perched lenses are usually found in the field. Frances lowered the plumb bob into the fourth bore until the brass point touched the bottom. When she raised it, damp sand clung to the tip. "Count what stays," she said. Alina left the holes open for 40 minutes. Water appeared in 2 of them, but not enough to measure with a cup. She covered each bore with an inverted tin can and flagged the grid so the animals would not step into it. "Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you watched where an animal returned after every other option dried up?" Alina had watched for 67 days. She had marked each wallow, each rain, each water haul, and every dark streak of clay on a hoof. The flagged grid did not come from guessing where water ought to be. It came from recording where 12 heavy animals crossed good grass to find cool soil during a dry week, and then checking whether the ground beneath them could explain why. She did not have proof yet. She had a repeatable observation. That afternoon, Alina placed 5 clay and sand samples in clean jelly jars. Each jar received a strip of masking tape marked with the bore number, depth, and position relative to the draw. She wrapped the groundwater manual in brown paper, put the black notebook in her shirt pocket, and drove to the Flint County Conservation Office. Douglas Crane had held his county position for 23 years. He was 54, thickset, with fair ruddy skin, sandy gray hair combed into a precise side part, and a trimmed mustache of the same color. Rectangular brown-framed glasses sat above a broad, blunt nose. He wore a tan county field shirt with button pockets, dark green twill trousers, and polished brown work boots. The steel-cased flow stopwatch on his belt had timed pump tests, terrace outlets, spillway discharge, and more hopeful seeps than he cared to count. Douglas knew Flint County soil by texture. He could distinguish terrace fill from native subsoil in one handful. He had watched wet spots appear below ponds after summer storms, watched landowners trench toward them, and watched those same trenches turn dry once the trapped pocket emptied. Alina placed the jars on his desk in bore order. Douglas examined the labels first. Then he opened the 4th jar, rubbed blue-gray clay between one thumb and forefinger, and looked at Alina's profile drawing. "Where is this?" "Harrow's back pasture, below the failed pond. No mapped spring there. I know, you've had rain, nothing measurable in 9 days when I took the first sample." Douglas picked up the jar containing wet sand from the 38-inch bore. "What are you proposing?" "A controlled bore outside the wallow. If the sand recharges, I'll open a collector trench along the clay." He looked at the brown paper-wrapped manual, then at Alina. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Douglas Crane started laughing. It began with one surprised breath through his nose, followed by a low chuckle he tried to stop before it became impolite. It was not a sharp laugh, and there was no cruelty in it. Douglas leaned back, removed his glasses, and rubbed one lens with the hem of his field shirt while the chuckle worked itself out. It was the laugh of a man who had watched dozens of hopeful landowners mistake temporary seepage for permanent water. One had dug 12 feet into a hillside after finding wet roots and produced enough water to fill a wash basin. Another had installed a concrete trough below a road ditch and spent more on pipe than the seep delivered in a month. Douglas had measured all of them. He put his glasses back on. That perched moisture will be gone by September. The sand was wet after 9 dry days. A clay pocket can hold water longer than that. The layer dips toward the draw, so does every layer under that slope. The animals returned to one location. They found cool mud. In a dry basin. Douglas slid the county groundwater map from a flat drawer and opened it across his desk. His thick forefinger followed the contour below the Harrow Ridge. The pond leaked. Water moved into disturbed soil under the embankment. Your buffalo opened the surface, and now you have leftover pond water sitting over clay. The pond has been dry since June. The clay beneath it has not. There's fine sand below the cap. There is fine sand all over Flint County. Alina did not argue. She opened the black notebook to the boring log and turned it so Douglas could read. Her handwriting stood small and upright across the page. Clay cap at 38 inches on the downslope point, 44 at the first upslope point, 51 at the second. Wet sand at the boundary in 4 bores. The lens drops 11 inches over 34 feet. The wallow is 7 feet above the draw floor. The animals returned through dry weather after drinking from the tank. Douglas studied the page. The failed pond sits uphill. 20 yards, that is your water, maybe. He looked up, apparently surprised by the answer. Alina capped the sample jars. "I'm not asking you to call it a spring." "What are you asking?" "To borrow a measuring tube if it flows." Douglas tapped the blank portion of the county map. "If it flows in September, I'll bring the tube myself." Alina placed the jars in their cardboard carrier and tucked the groundwater manual under one arm. August counts first. She left the office without changing Douglas's mind. She had not expected to. His doubt came from measurements taken before hers, and the only useful answer was another measurement. Let me tell you about the clay cap, because the difference between a mud pocket and a spring lies in whether water is trapped locally or arriving under continuing hydraulic pressure. The blue-gray clay beneath the harrow wallow was less permeable than the fine sand below it. Water entering the ridge through root channels, old cracks, and porous surface soil could descend until it reached that clay. Once there, downward movement slowed. The water spread sideways through the sand seam immediately above the clay, following the slope toward the draw. If the sand existed only as a small enclosed pocket, opening it would release a limited volume. The water level would rise once, fall as Alina removed it and fail to recover. Douglas would be right. But if the sand lens continued upslope beneath the pasture, it could receive infiltration across a much larger area. Water stored in those connected pores would move toward the lower outlet. The difference would not appear in the first muddy surge. It would appear in recharge after the hole had been emptied. Hydraulic heads supplied the push. Water entering the sand at a higher elevation carried potential energy relative to the lower bore. It did not need a deep artesian aquifer or a pump to move. It needed a connected permeable path, a confining layer beneath it, and an outlet lower than the recharge zone. Alina still did not know whether she had all three. She returned to the lease before evening and chose a bore 0.8 feet east of the main wallow. It lay beyond the churned soil but on the same contour as the wettest sample. She measured its position from 2 fence posts, recorded the distances, and drove a stake through a strip of white cloth. The temporary fence held the bison uphill. They stood in a loose line beyond it, broad heads lowered, while Alina cleared the surface with the shovel. The first foot came away dry. At 16 inches, the soil became mottled. At 30 inches, blue-gray clay filled the auger barrel and clung beneath the cutting edge. Alina scraped each sample onto burlap in order. She smelled the earth, rolled it between her fingers, and checked for sand grains. None appeared. At 36 inches, the clay remained dense. At 38, it softened. Alina knelt beside the bore with her olive work shirt darkened between the shoulders. Her silver wire-rimmed glasses had slipped low on her nose, and a smear of blue-gray clay crossed the freckles beneath them. She tightened both hands around the auger handle and turned it 1/2 rotation at a time. 39 inches. The cutting teeth met resistance, released, and dropped slightly. 40 inches. The next barrel held clay mixed with fine sand. Alina laid the sample beside the others and cleaned the auger teeth with the point of a nail. Frances stood outside the temporary wire, upright and still, the brass plumb bob hanging from her belt loop. Ruth had arrived from the grain office carrying the green savings ledger beneath one arm, but she did not open it. Alina set the auger back into the bore. Only 3 inches of the cap remained if the controlled point matched her grid. 3 inches could still end in dry sand. The wet samples in the jars might have come from trapped pond leakage. Douglas's county map might be blank because there was nothing here worth mapping. She turned the handle. The clay resisted through 1 full rotation, then the pressure eased beneath her palms. The auger descended without the sticky pull that had followed it through the blue-gray layer. Alina lifted it carefully. At 41 inches, the auger brought up clean wet sand, and water followed it into the hole. It climbed the wall of the bore slowly at first, darkening the clean sand and covering the auger marks 1 narrow ring at a time. Alina laid a steel rule against the opening while Ruth watched the second hand on Frances's kitchen watch. After 6 minutes, the water stood 9 inches above the clay boundary. After 14 minutes, it stood 15. At 23 minutes, it stopped rising at 18 inches. Alina dipped the hole dry with a tin cup, measured the volume removed, and waited. The level recovered to within 1 inch of its former height before the sun touched the ridge. A trapped pocket could refill once. She emptied it again. The second recovery took longer, but the water returned. The bison watched from beyond the white cloth strips while Alina repeated the test a 3rd time. Their broad shadows stretched downslope as the last light left the failed pond. Water returned through the exposed sand in several clear beads, joined along the lower side of the bore, and rose without any moisture entering from above. Alina touched the black notebook in her shirt pocket, then looked toward the pile of rejected drainage pipe beside the equipment shed. She had brought all 96 feet from Flint Tile Works in May because the pipe cost nothing, and because free material could wait until its purpose became clear. Flint Tile Works formed 4-inch perforated polyvinyl chloride drainage pipe in 20-foot lengths with a widened bell at one end. A bell had to remain round enough to receive the next pipe and tight enough for the joint to hold its alignment underground. The rejected pieces had cracked while cooling or had split when the forming mandrel withdrew. The plant could not sell them as full lengths. It paid 12 cents per foot to load and discard them because cracked bells made the pieces unsuitable for contracted field drainage. The straight sections behind those bells were sound. Their narrow slots remained evenly spaced, their walls carried no crushing damage, and sunlight had not yet made the plastic brittle. Most people see a cracked pipe and they see a failed product. Francis saw 40 inches of damage at the end of material that still knew how to carry water. Alina cut each bell away with a fine-toothed saw, squared the remaining ends against a carpenter's block, and checked the pipe by rolling it across the shed floor. 3 lengths rolled true. 1 lifted at the middle and rocked, so she set that piece aside. From the usable sections, she chose 12 feet for the collector and another 22 feet to carry water downhill. The remaining sound pipe went beneath a tarpaulin. Ruth entered no value in the green ledger yet. Material had to work before she counted what it replaced. Alina returned to the wallow the next morning with the $18 hand auger, the $4 shovel, 2 lengths of pipe, and the used galvanized stock tank she had bought for $28. She opened a trench from the controlled bore toward the draw, following the top of the blue-gray clay. The wet sand lay against the uphill face. Because that face released water as soon as the shovel exposed it, Alina placed the perforated pipe directly beneath it, less than 2 inches from undisturbed sand. She thought closeness would gather more water. That assumption made sense until water began carrying the formation with it. She surrounded the collector with ungraded gravel from a county pit. The load contained pieces nearly as large as walnuts, fragments the size of corn kernels, and a small amount of sand, all mixed together. Alina forked it into the trench without separating the sizes. The large voids between stones gave water an easy path toward the pipe slots, and the $34.50 load seemed coarse enough to keep mud away. She joined the collector to the outlet pipe with 2 of the $9.60 couplings, ran the line downslope, and set its open end above the rim of the used tank. The fall was visible to the eye. She did not measure the pitch. At 11 minutes past 1, a muddy thread reached the outlet. It struck the galvanized bottom with a hollow tapping sound, paused, and resumed. By 2 o'clock, the thread had become a narrow, continuous stream. By 4, the tank held 27 gallons. Ruth marked the depth against a broom handle and converted inches to volume using the tank dimensions Alina had written in the black notebook. Frances stood beside the temporary fence with her brass plumb bob hanging motionless from one hand. None of them called it a spring. They watched the water rise. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The tank gained water all afternoon, the outlet ran without a pump, and the bison crowded the fence until Alina admitted them one at a time. The first cow lowered her muzzle into water that had not arrived behind a tractor. The bull drank last, lifted his head, and let a silver rope fall from his chin. Alina measured the tank again at dusk. The collector had supplied enough to replace what the animals drank and add another 11 gallons. Ruth opened the green ledger, but Alina stopped her with one muddy finger. "Tomorrow," she said, "that didn't last." By morning, the tank water had turned the color of weak coffee. Fine sand lay in a fan beneath the outlet pipe. Alina caught 1 quart in a glass jar and held it toward the sun. The largest grains settled within seconds, but a pale cloud remained suspended above them. The outlet still flowed, though less than it had the evening before. She measured 1.16 gallons per minute with a marked bucket and Ruth's watch. At noon, the rate had fallen below 1 gallon. By sunset, it measured 0.62. Water still stood behind the collector, but it could no longer pass freely through the slots. Alina closed the temporary fence and uncovered the first coupling. When she separated the outlet line, wet sand spilled across her boots. She pushed a stiff wire into the perforated section and met resistance before the wire had traveled 18 inches. The pipe was packed. Fine grains from the lens had moved into the wide spaces between the pit gravel, reached the slots, and lodged wherever velocity dropped. The gravel had not filtered the formation. It had merely given it larger passages. Each grain that entered left room for another, and the flow itself pulled more sand toward the collector face. She removed the outlet pipe, washed it, and measured again from the open coupling. The rate briefly rose to 0.84 gallons per minute, then sank as another ribbon of sand entered. Alina scraped back the gravel nearest the exposed face. A hollow had formed where undisturbed material had stood that morning. The moving water had carried enough sand to make the face retreat nearly 3 inches. If she allowed that process to continue, the clay roof could slump, the collector could deform, and muddy surface water could enter through the collapse. At 3 o'clock the next afternoon, the flow fell to 0.38 gallons per minute. Ruth wrote the number in the black notebook because Alina's hands were inside the trench. At 0.38 gallons per minute, the collector could still yield 547.2 gallons over a full day if it held steady, but it was not holding steady. 10 minutes later, another plug of sand reduced the stream to a pulse. Alina opened the coupling again. The inside wall carried a packed layer almost level with the bottom slots. She broke it loose with wire, flushed the pipe, and watched the same failure begin again. Let me tell you about the first collector, because its failure gave Alina a more difficult answer than a dry hole would have given her. Water was present. The 18-inch recovery had shown that, but water moving through fine sand can carry the sand unless the entrance is built to restrain it. A collector requires open space near its perforations so water can enter without excessive resistance. The native formation requires the opposite. Its grains need a boundary fine enough to prevent them from migrating. Between those demands, the filter must change gradually, with each layer holding back the next finer layer while remaining permeable enough to pass water. Alina had placed large, mixed gravel against fine sand. The contrast was too great. The smallest formation grains slipped through the spaces between the largest stones, therefore the collector drew the aquifer into itself. She sketched the failed section in the notebook. Beside the exposed face, she drew arrows carrying sand through gravel and into the pipe. Beneath the drawing, she wrote 3 questions. What size retained the native sand? What size passed water without sealing? How many layers could fit inside a trench she still had to dig by hand? Douglas's sentence sat 3 pages earlier. That perched moisture will be gone by September. September was 12 days away. The feed envelope held $26.40 after the week's mineral purchase. Alina still owed the second half of the fencing bill before October. The annual lease payment was already gone, but walking away would stop the hauling fuel, preserve the home pasture, and leave the remaining buffalo feed for animals she could sell before prices softened. Staying meant opening the trench again, buying washed gravel in sizes the county pit did not ordinarily separate, and trusting water she could not yet deliver cleanly. That evening, she forked the failed gravel onto a sheet of corrugated tin so it could be washed and sorted rather than wasted. She capped the outlet, covered the exposed sand with damp burlap, and drove the tractor home with the empty wagon rattling behind her. Ruth left the green ledger on the kitchen table. No new entry had been made. After midnight, Alina sat alone in the equipment shed beneath one enamel lamp. Her faded olive work shirt had dried stiff with clay. The black notebook lay open beside the groundwater manual, 3 jars of sand, and the coupling she had removed from the failed line. When she turned it, packed grains fell onto the page that carried Douglas's warning. She added the flow readings in order from the first full stream to the last week measurement. The line descended across the paper as plainly as a feed account spending itself empty. The bison needed water before daylight. The tractor needed fuel to haul it. The rebuilt collector would need material she had not yet found, and the lease contained 4 words that had become harder each time she read them. No credit for water improvements. If she restored the spring and left, the spring stayed with Leon's ground. If she failed, every dollar stayed gone. Alina took off her silver wire-rimmed glasses, pressed both palms against her eyes, and listened to the shed cool around her. The drill press ticked. A mouse moved behind the sacks of mineral. Outside, the empty wagon tank gave one soft metallic pop as the night air contracted its sides. She turned to a clean line beneath the falling measurements. Alone after midnight, Alina wrote 1 word beside the falling flow rate: quit. The word remained there until Frances entered the shed before dawn. She wore the blue chambray blouse beneath her brown herringbone cardigan, and her black farm shoes made almost no sound on the packed earth floor. Alina had fallen asleep upright with one forearm across the groundwater manual. Frances did not wake her with a question. She read the page, removed the brass plumb bob from her belt loop, and set it beside the word. The point rested exactly on the notebook line. Alina opened her eyes. She looked at the brass weight, then at Frances. Frances said nothing. Alina put on her glasses, drew 1 line through quit, and turned the page. The plumb bob had measured fence posts, wall forms, tank stands, and the first uneven door Alina had hung at 19. Frances used it because the tool did not care how a line appeared from across a room. It answered one question. Alina tied its cord to the edge of the workbench and lowered the point beside a jar of native sand. The weight became a pendulum over the grains while she read the manual's chapter on wells completed in unconsolidated formations. Let me tell you about graded filters, because the first collector did not fail from lack of water. It failed because Alina gave moving sand an open road. Fine water-bearing sand contains particles of different sizes packed into contact. Water can pass through the connected spaces between them, but when a trench exposes the formation, the pressure pattern changes. Flow bends toward the opening. Velocity increases near the collector because the same volume must pass through a smaller area. If the material beside that opening has spaces larger than the mobile grains, those grains move with the water. Once migration begins, the formation loosens, more grains become available, and the collector fills from the bottom upward. A proper filter interrupts that movement without closing the water path. The layer touching the native sand must be fine enough that the larger formation grains bridge across its openings. Behind that layer, a somewhat coarser layer supports it. Coarser washed stone can surround the perforated pipe because the pipe needs high permeability, and because the finer layers outside prevent native sand from ever reaching those larger voids. The arrangement appears backward if a person thinks only about drainage. Coarse material belongs nearest the pipe. Successively finer material belongs toward the formation. Alina did not own a set of laboratory sieves. She had window screen, hardware cloth, a flour sifter Frances would not permit back into the kitchen, and 3 wooden frames Ruth built from scrap lath before breakfast. They spread the remaining pit gravel on corrugated tin and washed it with hauled water. Mud and dust left first. Alina passed the clean material through the largest screen, then the hardware cloth, then the finer mesh. The pile separated into coarse stone, middle gravel, and particles small enough to sit against the native sand without vanishing into it. She tested the smallest fraction in a fruit jar. Native sand went beneath it, water above it. She inverted the jar over cloth and watched the first cloudy discharge clear. When she repeated the test with coarse gravel directly against the native sample, sand poured through. With the finer fraction between them, only a trace escaped before the grains bridged. It was not a laboratory filter design, but it answered the question that had stopped the first trench. Alina wrote the screen openings and results in the notebook. Ruth wrote the cost of replacement screen as 0 because every piece had come from the shed. At the lease, Alina removed all ungraded gravel from the wet face. She cut the first collector free, carried it to the tank, and flushed each slot from the inside until clean water emerged along its entire length. Several slots held grains wedged so tightly that wire polished them before they released. She marked the plugged area with pencil. The worst blockage lay opposite the exposed sand face, where water had entered fastest. She moved the new trench 28 inches into undisturbed ground, parallel to the lens rather than directly beneath the collapsing face. That left a controlled wall of native material between the original excavation and the collector. Water would pass through intact sand before reaching the filter envelope. Alina cut a second 12-foot section from the free pipe, rejected one end where a hairline split extended beyond the old bell, and drilled no new holes. The factory slots were narrow and regular. Enlarging them would only invite the middle gravel inside. Frances held the plumb bob while Alina established the outlet elevation. A collector that fell too sharply could draw hardest at its lower end and leave the upper slots underused. One that rose even slightly could trap air and sediment. Alina chose a pitch of 1/8 inch per foot. Over 12 feet, the collector dropped 1 1/2 inches. She drove 2 stakes, stretched a cord, checked the fall with a clear water tube, and used the brass point to transfer the line into the trench. The pipe looked almost level. It was not. She placed washed coarse stone beneath the pipe and worked it under the lower curve so no hollow remained. More coarse stone went around both sides and 2 inches above the crown. The middle gravel followed, packed gently by hand rather than rammed, because crushing the layers together would mix their grain sizes. Against the native sand, she laid the finest washed fraction in a continuous envelope. Wherever a large stone touched the formation, she removed it. Wherever native sand spilled inward, she cut the edge clean and replaced the disturbed section. The work took 3 days because each bucket had to be screened, washed, carried, and placed without scrambling the layers. Ruth handled the screen frames in quick, compact steps, her copper-red hair held back by the navy cloth band and the green ledger set safely beneath the tank stand. Frances checked the trench with a plumb bob and corrected one support by less than 1/4 inch. Elena worked below them in the clay, her collar-length chestnut hair tied low, her boots sunk to the ankles, and her black notebook wrapped inside an oilcloth feed sack. At the upper end of the collector, Elena added a vertical cleanout riser with a removable cap. If sediment entered again, she could flush the pipe from above without uncovering the entire trench. She turned the lower outlet through a sweep rather than a sharp elbow, then supported the coupling on packed gravel so the joint could not sag. The remaining outlet ran downhill to the galvanized tank. Before covering anything, she poured water through the riser. It reached the tank carrying a small amount of installation grit, then cleared. The filter protected the collector from below and beside, but the top still required a seal. Rainwater crossing manure, trampled soil, or the failed pond bed could not be allowed to run directly into the spring. Elena replaced the blue-gray clay above the gravel in thin lifts. She broke each lump, dampened it, and compacted it with the flat end of a fence post until the clay formed a continuous cap. The finished surface rose slightly over the trench and sloped away on both sides. Surface runoff would shed toward the draw instead of following the pipe line downward. She extended temporary fencing around the collection area, leaving enough distance that hooves could not break the clay seal. The outlet entered the stock tank through open air, with a visible gap between pipe and water so contaminated tank water could not siphon backward. An overflow on the opposite side carried excess water into a stone apron below the fence. Every piece could be inspected. Every joint could be reached. On the first flush, the outlet ran brown. Elena caught the discharge in white enamel pans and emptied them below the draw. The second flush carried fewer grains. The third remained cloudy for 6 minutes, then cleared from brown to gray and from gray to a faint haze. She held a jar against the afternoon sky. A few grains settled at the bottom, but the water above them became transparent. The collector continued running while she waited. Ruth measured the stock tank at 4 o'clock, again at 5, and again at 6. The water gained at the same rate after each reading. Elena allowed the first bison through the gate shortly before sunset. 12 animals approached without the hauled water wagon standing beside the tank. They drank in turn, backed away, and returned to grass. The tank level fell under their demand, held for 11 minutes, and began climbing while the last cow was still drinking. Ruth opened the green ledger. "Not yet," Elena said. This time Ruth did not close it. She rested her pencil on the page and waited. The next morning the tank stood at the overflow. Clear water crossed the stone apron in a narrow sheet and entered the grass below. Elena lifted the cleanout cap. No sand had accumulated at the upper end. She opened the lower coupling over a pan. 7 grains appeared, then clear water. The filter envelope was holding. Douglas Crane arrived on September 28th carrying his steel-cased flow stopwatch, a calibrated 5-gallon container, a measuring rod, and the county field book. He walked heel-first down the slope with deliberate, evenly spaced steps, pausing first at the fenced collection area rather than the tank. He examined the clay cap, traced the outlet route, and looked through the clear gap where water entered the tank. "You moved it," he said, 28 inches. Why? Undisturbed formation. Douglas crouched beside the overflow. Filter, 3 washed sizes, fine against the lens, coarse around the pipe. He glanced at Elena. The trimmed sandy gray mustache did not move. "Show me the cleanout." She removed the cap. Douglas lowered the measuring rod until it touched the inside bottom, withdrew it, and inspected the wet mark. He found no sediment deep enough to record. He walked to the tank inlet and diverted the entire stream into the calibrated container. Elena stood squarely beside him while Ruth held the green ledger unopened and Frances watched from the fence. Douglas started the stopwatch when water touched the bottom mark. He stopped it at 5 gallons, emptied the container, and repeated the test. The second result differed from the first by less than 1 second. He took a third reading, then waited 15 minutes while the collector ran freely into the tank. The fourth test matched the second. He calculated on the margin of his field book, checked the container graduation with the measuring rod, and ran one final timed fill. The number did not fall. On September 28th, the rebuilt collector delivered 2.74 gallons per minute. That rate meant more than a full tank by morning. Multiplied across 60 minutes, the collector supplied 164.4 gallons per hour. Across 24 hours, it supplied 3,945.6 gallons per day. The 12 bison had consumed between 178 and 231 gallons on Alina's hottest recorded days, including what they spilled and what evaporated from the open tank. Even if the herd doubled, the measured spring held a wide margin above its daily demand. Alina did not use the highest possible livestock estimate to flatter the result. She opened the black notebook to July and August, totaled the actual hauled volumes, subtracted water returned unused, and divided by animal days. Ruth checked the arithmetic twice. The collector's daily yield exceeded the herd's heaviest recorded demand by more than 17 times. The tank and overflow did not store all of that water, but storage was no longer the limiting question. The lens replenished faster than the animals emptied the tank. Douglas measured the flow again after the herd drank. It remained 2.74 gallons per minute. Let me tell you about the cost beside that number, because water can be plentiful and still ruin an operation if obtaining it requires debt. The drilled well contractor had quoted $8,640 for casing, drilling, pump equipment, wiring, and a pressure tank, with no guarantee that the first hole would produce livestock water. Alina's collector required an auger for $18, a shovel for $4, washed gravel for $34.50, couplings for $9.60, and the used stock tank for $28. The rejected perforated pipe cost nothing. The waterworks total came to $94.10. Against the well quote, the avoided cost was $8,545.90. Ruth entered that figure in the green cloth-bound ledger on its own line. She did not combine it with hauling savings because avoided construction cost and reduced operating expense were different kinds of value. Beneath it, she began another column for tractor fuel, oil, wagon tire wear, and the maintenance allowance attached to engine hours. Each day the wagon stayed parked received one dated entry. She still did not count Alina's time. There was no assigned figure for it. The entire startup account remained separate. The annual lease was $1,200. Fencing cost $312. The auger cost $18, the shovel $4, the gravel $34.50, the couplings $9.60, the tank $28, and the black oilcloth notebook 75 cents. Total startup was $1,606.85. Every figure tied to a receipt or a dated notebook line. Nothing entered the ledger merely because it sounded valuable. Let me tell you about that ledger, because the small lines began exposing a much larger operation hidden inside a patch of wet clay. Before the spring, the Harrow pasture looked cheap because it lacked dependable water. Its grass had been priced as though late summer made half the acreage unusable. Alina's fence converted the boundary into control, but control without water only delayed failure. The collector changed the pasture's carrying period. Grass beyond the failed pond could now be grazed when the home farm needed recovery, and the bison could remain on leased forage without 2 tractor trips each day. The ledger caught that change in fuel, machine hours, feed deferred, and dealer costs avoided. Ruth carried it between the tank and kitchen table, one shoulder slightly forward, amber-framed glasses low, while she checked Alina's figures. At the end of October, she drew a single line beneath the entries but did not total them until Alina supplied every remaining fuel receipt. Frances watched the columns grow without commenting. Once she touched the brass plumb bob at her belt and asked whether Ruth had counted the unused length of free pipe. "No," Ruth said, "it hasn't done anything yet." Frances nodded. Leon Harrow came to the pasture 2 days after Douglas's flow test. The brass leasebox key hung from his belt by its short chain, tapping his faded bib overalls as he crossed the draw in slow, broad steps. He stopped first at the old pond, looked at the dry basin, then followed the outlet line to the stock tank. Clear water entered above the rim and left through the overflow. 12 bison grazed beyond the fenced collection zone. Leon removed his rimless spectacles and cleaned them with a red corner of his checked flannel shirt. "That from under my pond. From a sand lens below the ridge," Alina said. "Same difference to the grass. No, the recharge area has to stay protected." Leon put his spectacles back on. "How much?" 2.74 gallons a minute. He looked uphill for a long time. The 160-acre back pasture had been leased cheaply because he considered its water unreliable. A pasture that carried buffalo through late summer was worth more than the document on his kitchen table suggested. Alina knew it. Leon knew it. Neither pretended otherwise. "The lease says no credit for improvements," he said. "I read it. It also fixes the payment through the term." "Yes." Leon touched the leasebox key, then it stays fixed. He did not praise the collector and he did not ask for more money. He walked the fence around the spring, tested one post with both hands, and offered 3 rolls of used woven wire stored in his north barn. The wire remained his, but Alina could use it around the collection zone for as long as the lease lasted. He told her which roll had a broken stay near the center. That was all. Douglas returned the following week for a full inspection. He walked above the collector instead of beginning at the outlet. A spring could test clean at one moment and become fouled by the first hard rain if the recharge area admitted runoff. He checked the distance from the failed pond, the slope of the compacted clay, the separation between livestock and trench, and the path taken by overflow. He opened the cleanout riser, passed the measuring rod through the collector, and found only a thin trace of settled grit. At the outlet, he inspected the open air gap and watched the tank overflow without backing against the pipe. He asked Alina where she had placed the finest filter material. She drew the section in bare soil with the tip of the shovel. Native sand, fine washed fraction, middle gravel, coarse stone, perforated pipe. Douglas corrected the angle of one line with his boot and asked how she had selected the fractions. Screens and jar tests. Screen openings recorded, in the notebook. Flushing time, recorded. He read the pages while standing beside the tank. The notes included the failed collector, the declining measurements, the packed coupling, and the word crossed out after midnight. Alina had not removed that page. A design that omitted its failure could not explain why the replacement worked. Douglas closed his field book, looked at Alina, and said, "I was wrong." The 3 words remained between them for several seconds. Douglas's shoulders stayed back, but one hand tightened around the steel case of his stopwatch. He had laughed because his experience told him the wet sand came from a dyeing pocket beneath a failed pond. The measurements had answered him, and he did not bargain with them. Then he looked toward the temporary fence. "You need a wider exclusion." "How wide?" "I'll flag it." He returned to the county truck for a roll of orange tape, 2 soil maps, and a hand level. Practical help was easier for him than apology, but it was not a substitute for the apology. He had already given that plainly. Let me tell you about what Douglas did next, because being wrong changed his work before it changed his opinion of Alina. He filed the site as a verified perennial SEEP, which meant the county would retain the location, flow measurements, construction sketch, and water test in its conservation file. The word perennial did not promise that the rate would never fall. It meant the outlet persisted beyond the immediate influence of a storm and recovered under repeated withdrawal. Douglas entered the initial flow as 2.74 gallons per minute and scheduled dry season measurements. He helped Alina mark a fenced collection zone extending upslope beyond the trench. The bison could graze outside it, but they could not stand over the clay cap, rub against the cleanout riser, or manure near the point where shallow groundwater emerged. Douglas placed the upper boundary far enough from the failed pond that runoff would turn toward the draw before reaching the collector. Leon's woven wire replaced the temporary smooth strands. Alina built a narrow inspection gate and hung the brass leasebox key on its staple while Leon tested the latch. Douglas also arranged a sanitary water test through the county office. Alina filled the sample bottle without touching its mouth, allowed the outlet to run before collection, and delivered it the same morning. The result found no evidence of contamination in the submitted sample. Douglas still told her to inspect the clay seal after every heavy rain and to test again if the water changed in taste, odor, or clarity. A shallow spring required protection precisely because it responded to the land above it. Frances examined the verified flow sheet at the kitchen table. Her tortoiseshell reading glasses rested low on her small hooked nose while she followed Douglas's arithmetic from timed volume to gallons per minute and then to daily yield. Ruth stood beside her with the green ledger beneath one arm. Alina waited across the table, squarely planted in mud-darkened boots, saying nothing. Frances reached the line showing 3,945.6 gallons per day. She read it again, removed her glasses, and folded the sheet once. "You were right," she said. Alina looked at the brass plumb bob resting beside the black notebook. "We measured it," she replied. Frances picked up the plumb bob and returned it to her belt loop. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The bison gained weight through October, the hauling wagon stayed parked behind the machine shed, and Ruth's ledger kept filling. Grass rested on the 74-acre home farm while the harrow pasture carried the herd. Alina sold no breeding animals to cover fuel. The spring ran beneath a skin of morning ice, entered the tank through open air, and left by the overflow whenever the animals had finished drinking. That didn't last. The late 70s had taught Flint County farmers to treat rising land values as stored wealth. Equipment grew larger, grain storage expanded, and loans that once seemed manageable were renewed at higher rates. A tractor purchased on credit still had to make its payment when wheat fell. A quarter section pledged against an operating note still carried the same acres when the bank changed its terms. Families who had survived dry years through caution found themselves competing beside operations built on borrowed expansion. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It turned ordinary renewal dates into forced decisions. Farmers sold nearly new combines because one payment released more cash than a season of thin grain margins. Land bought with short equity was refinanced against land already owned, therefore one weak parcel placed the home place at risk. Breeding cows went through sale rings in groups large enough to change local prices. Neighbors cut herds not because the grass had failed yet, but because the note came due before the rain. By the spring of 1980, auction notices appeared on the feed store board beside seed advertisements and church suppers. Leon read them without comment. Douglas began carrying extra property maps because conservation visits increasingly ended with questions about which terrace, pond, or machinery shed could be sold. Francis moved household money from one envelope to another, but never touched the amount reserved for taxes. Ruth added a column to the green ledger for costs Alina did not incur because the lease had been paid without borrowing. Alina had no expansion note. Francis's condition had prevented it. Lease it, but don't borrow. That sentence had forced Alina to use the cracked pipe, the used tank, the hand auger, and her own labor because no lender stood ready to convert impatience into equipment. It had also limited the scale. 12 bison could be watered from one tank and managed behind $312 of fence. 40 animals would have required more land, stronger handling facilities, and purchased winter feed. Alina had wanted 40. The arithmetic permitted 12. When drought settled over Flint County in 1980, the smaller number held. Rain missed Morrow Bend in May, returned for one narrow storm in June, and disappeared through July. The Harrow Ridge browned from the crest downward. Big bluestem folded its leaves, buffalo grass cured close to the soil, and the failed pond developed cracks wide enough to accept Alina's fingers. The home farm's shallow stock pond receded behind a rim of black mud. Neighbors began hauling water before sunrise so engines could cool before afternoon. Alina measured the spring each Monday. The rate held above 2.5 gallons per minute through June. In July, it declined by hundredths, then by tenths as the perched lens released stored water faster than the dry ridge replaced it. Alina cleared the overflow apron, checked the cleanout riser, and opened the lower coupling to rule out another blockage. The pipe contained no packed sand. The water remained clear. The decline came from the formation. Douglas measured independently on July 21st. His stopwatch gave 2.36 gallons per minute. He returned 1 week later and obtained 2.28. Alina marked both figures beside rainfall totals, herd demand, and tank depth. The spring was weakening, but the filter envelope was not failing. A collector cannot create recharge. It can only deliver what the ground stores above its outlet. The bison drank more during the heat. Alina counted each visit, measured tank loss after the herd moved away, and inspected the overflow at dawn. The tank recovered before noon. Even at the declining rate, supply remained many times greater than demand. She did not add animals merely because water remained available. Grass, not water, had become the limit, therefore she rotated the herd earlier, extended rest periods, and fed from the hay reserve before the pasture roots were grazed too closely. Ruth's ledger recorded that decision as an expense, not a failure. Hay fed in July cost money. Grass plants kept alive below the grazing line retained future forage. She entered both only when Alina could support the figures. The green book now held fuel avoided, machinery hours avoided, purchased water avoided, the well cost not incurred, and every new cost attached to protecting the spring. Its pages did not make the drought smaller. They prevented the drought from hiding where money had gone. Across the county, shallow dug wells failed in succession. Tanks supplied by windmills emptied when water levels fell below pump cylinders. Ponds warmed, shrank, and fouled along their edges. Some operators paid for emergency drilling at the same time interest charges consumed their operating cash. Others sold cattle because a herd without water had no bargaining time. Alina still had bargaining time. On August 11th, Douglas stood beside the galvanized tank while heat shimmered above the failed pond. His tan field shirt had darkened beneath the arms. Alina diverted the full outlet into his calibrated container. Douglas timed 5 gallons, emptied it, and repeated the test after the herd drank. Ruth held the measuring rod while Francis watched from beneath the narrow shade of the equipment awning Leon had built beside the fence. The first test showed 2.21 gallons per minute. The second showed the same. At that rate, the collector delivered 132.6 gallons each hour. Across 24 hours, the spring supplied 3,182.4 gallons per day. The drought had reduced the September proof rate by 0.53 gallons per minute, but the daily yield still exceeded the 12 bison's hottest recorded demand by more than 13 times. Douglas entered the figure in the county file. Alina entered it in the black notebook. Ruth wrote it in the green ledger beside the cost of hay and the fuel not burned hauling water. Frances touched the brass plumb bob at her belt, looked at the overflow, and said nothing. The spring continued losing small fractions through the remainder of August, then stabilized near the measured rate. Alina walked the protected recharge boundary each evening, checking for cracks in the clay cap and places where runoff might cut through the fence line. She found one shallow wash above the collector, filled it with compacted soil, and laid grass stems across the repair to slow the next rain whenever it came. Beyond the harrow boundary, 2 empty stock tanks stood beside a neighbor's windmill. Another operator had parked a water truck at the county hydrant before dawn. A third had loaded half his cows for sale because the bank would not renew both his feed note and his equipment note. Nobody laughed at Alina's pipe now, but she did not look toward those places with satisfaction. She checked her own tank, counted 12 animals, and recorded the hour. By August 1980, neighboring tanks were dry, but Alina's overflow pipe was still running. It did more than run. It gave Alina enough water to share without surrendering the ground that produced it. Let me tell you about the separate trough, because Alina would not allow emergency use to turn the spring box into a public watering hole. Livestock unfamiliar with the fence crowded water, leaned against posts, and cut wet soil with their hooves. One afternoon of trampling above the collector could break the clay cap, drive dirty runoff into the gravel envelope, or bend the cleanout riser below the soil line. Alina therefore ran the unused 23 feet of rejected pipe downhill from the overflow into a second galvanized trough beyond the protected strip. She cut away both cracked bell ends, joined the sound section with one of the couplings already in storage, and set the trough on compacted gravel where visiting trailers could reach it without crossing the spring fence. Douglas inspected the connection before the first neighboring cattle arrived. The spring continued feeding Alina's tank first. Only overflow entered the second trough, and another open-air gap prevented water from backing toward the collector. A float marker showed how far the trough fell during each visit. Alina measured the dimensions, calculated gallons per inch, and wrote the conversion in the black oilcloth notebook. Water left on a schedule. It was never promised beyond the measured surplus. A nearby operator brought 8 cows on August 23rd. He arrived before sunrise, opened the trailer into a temporary pen, and let 4 animals drink at a time. Alina recorded the trough level before and after, the recovery time, the spring flow, and the condition of the clay cap. The cows took 106 gallons. The trough recovered in less than an hour. 2 days later, 6 bred heifers took 79 gallons. Ruth entered each volume in the green ledger but assigned no invented sale price to the water. The entries showed what the spring had carried and what fuel the neighbors avoided burning. When one man offered to drive his full herd across the harrow pasture, Alina shook her head. "Bring 6 at a time." He did. The arrangement lasted until cooler September weather reduced demand. Nobody parked over the recharge strip, no animal entered the collector fence, and no hose was lowered into Alina's primary tank. Douglas's orange flags stayed upright along the upper boundary. The spring supplied scheduled stock because Alina separated generosity from damage. The first rain returned as a narrow line from the west on September 6th. It darkened the ridge, filled the shallow wash above the collector, and ran around the compacted repair Alina had made in August. She stood in the rain wearing her faded olive canvas shirt, chestnut brown hair tied low, and watched the collector outlet through silver wire-rim glasses beaded with water. The flow clouded for less than a minute at the overflow pond but remained clear at the tank inlet. The recharge strip had held. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because survival in one drought did not give Alina permission to grow carelessly after it. The herd began with 12 head in 1977. 4 seasons of calf sales, breeding selections, and measured pasture recovery brought it to 18 in 1981. Alina could have reached that number sooner by financing bred animals, but Ruth's ledger did not authorize possibilities. It authorized purchases only after accumulated sales and recorded savings could cover them in cash. In 1978, gross receipts were $12,480. That figure included breeding stock and meat sales before feed, lease, fencing maintenance, veterinary costs, transport, and taxes. It was not take-home income, and Ruth never treated it as such. In 1981, gross receipts reached $19,365. After every operating bill was paid and the tax reserve remained untouched, Alina bought 6 bred animals with retained earnings. The herd did not increase by 6 immediately because culling and sales continued. By year's end, 18 sound animals remained. Most people see free pipe and they see a temporary repair. Alina saw a component that had already been engineered, tested, and discarded for damage she could cut away. 4-inch perforated PVC carried soil loads when properly bedded, admitted water along a controlled length, resisted decay, and presented a smooth interior that could be flushed. Flint Tile Works gave it away because cracked bell ends prevented sale and cost 12 cents per foot to discard. The cracks did not run through the sound barrel. Alina removed the failed ends and used the remaining length within a graded filter that carried the soil instead of asking the pipe wall to bridge an open trench. The same distinction governed every later purchase. Used wire was useful if its stays held tension. A stock tank was useful if its seams remained sound. Cheap equipment that required constant repair was not thrift, it was delayed cost. Francis had put the distinction into fewer words years before: count what stays, not what shines. Ruth wrote the line inside the front cover of the green ledger. Beneath it she added the purchasing rule. Nothing new entered the operation until savings already accumulated could pay for it, and nothing counted as savings until the avoided expense could be tied to a receipt, a measured quantity, or a dealer quote. The rule slowed Alina through good years. It also kept the bank from deciding her pace during bad ones. By 1984, the herd held 27 head. Alina divided the harrow pasture into 4 rotational paddocks with cash-bought posts and used woven wire, moving the animals according to grass height and recovery rather than a calendar date. She left the spring's upper recharge strip outside every grazing cell. The collector fence became the fixed point around which the lanes turned. Ruth totaled pasture days, hay fed, and sale weights. Frances checked the ledger without taking it over. Her iron-gray braid remained pinned into its low coil, and the brass plumb bob still hung from her belt when she crossed the equipment shed to test a post or hang a gate. She no longer asked whether the spring would hold. She asked whether Alina had measured after the last hard rain. Word traveled the way water travels on flat ground, slowly at first, then farther than anyone remembered carrying it. A customer mentioned Alina's breeding animals at the Morrow Bend feed store. A livestock hauler noticed that her stock arrived after dry summers with sound feet and even condition. Douglas told operators with shallow seep ground that a collector could work if they protected recharge, graded the filter correctly, and accepted that some wet places were only seasonal. He never called Alina's system a recipe. He recommended that they see it. When visitors came, Alina showed them the failed pond before the flowing tank. She made them walk the slope, look at the clay cap, and read the descending flow figures from the drought. If they asked whether cracked pipe made free water, she said, "The ground makes the water." By 1988, 41 bison grazed under the Mercer account. Gross receipts that year reached $47,920. The figure came after 11 years of work, not 11 months, and the herd had grown from retained calves and paid-for purchases while the 74-acre home farm remained unencumbered. The green ledger occupied a kitchen drawer of its own. Ruth had added indexes for pasture, water, breeding stock, and equipment, though the first page still carried Frances's line. For a while, things actually seemed fine. Spring rain filled the grass roots, the collector ran clear, and Alina had enough retained cash to replace 2 gate lines before they failed. That didn't last, because attention introduced a new kind of pressure. Buyers began asking for animals raised on the same dependable pasture system they had heard about from haulers and feed store counters. They were not coming to buy a pipe. They were coming to buy breeding stock that had been selected under measured forage, controlled rotation, and water that did not disappear in August. The first livestock trailer from outside Flint County arrived in May 1988. It belonged to a husband-and-wife operation from 2 counties west, both adults, who had spent 3 dry summers hauling water to a small bison herd. They backed into Alina's loading lane shortly after 7 in the morning and examined 6 yearling heifers before choosing 4. Alina gave them weight records, health dates, and a page showing the pasture conditions under which each animal had been raised. She did not promise drought-proof stock. She explained that animals selected on steady forage and clean water had not been forced through the repeated weight loss caused by failing ponds and emergency movement. The buyers walked down to the spring before loading. Alina's gray-green eyes followed their boots at the exclusion gate. "Stay outside the wire," she said. They did. More trailers came that summer, some for breeding animals, others carrying operators who wanted to inspect the pasture before deciding. The Mercer herd looked ordinary from a distance. The animals grazed, drank, rested, and moved when Alina opened a lane. The difference appeared in the records. Pasture rest periods were written down. Water flow was measured. Sale weights were compared against feed costs. Animals that could not hold condition on the available forage did not remain merely because Alina liked their appearance. Let me tell you about the failed pond, because leaving part of it unrepaired prevented dirty storm runoff from backing into the spring collector. A natural impulse would have been to deepen the basin, seal its cracks, and store every gallon visible on the site. Alina refused. The pond occupied the lowest surface depression above and beside the seep, but the collector worked below ground by intercepting water moving through the sand lens before it emerged into mud. If she turned the old basin into a deep reservoir, storm water carrying soil, manure, and decaying plant matter could stand above the lens outlet. During high water, that hydraulic head could push turbid surface water toward the collector envelope or submerge the discharge route. She therefore left the upper basin shallow and dry through ordinary weather. A broad grassed swale carried storm runoff around the recharge strip. The lower edge became an overflow pond only after clear collector discharge passed through the stock tank and the separate trough. That pond was not connected backward to the spring. Its inlet dropped through open air, and its emergency spillway discharged into the draw below the collector elevation. During a June storm in 1989, the distinction proved itself. 2 inches of rain crossed the Harrow Ridge in less than 3 hours. Brown runoff entered the old pond depression and moved through the grassed bypass. At the same time, clear spring overflow entered the lower pond through the pipe. The waters remained separated until both reached the draw well below the collection point. Alina sampled the tank inlet after the storm. It remained clear. The system carried 3 different loads, and confusing them would have ruined it. The buried collector intercepted subsurface flow through graded sand and gravel. The overflow route carried excess discharge away without allowing pressure to build against the pipe. The fenced buffer carried no water at all, but it prevented hoof impact, manure, and broken clay from entering the first 2 systems. Douglas explained that division to visitors with the same steel case stopwatch clipped to his belt. He had stopped laughing years earlier. Now he corrected anyone who called the outlet a drain from the pond. "It's a seep collector," he said. "The pond is surface water." Alina added paddocks as cash allowed, but no fence crossed the upper recharge strip. She used protected overflow ponds in lower cells, filling them from excess discharge only when gravity provided enough fall. Where the land rose, she did not pump. A pump would have turned a dependable low-cost flow into fuel use, maintenance, and another machine that could fail. Instead, lanes brought animals back toward gravity-fed water, and grazing periods remained short enough to protect the path. By 1992, the herd reached 56 head. The operation controlled more grass through long leases, but Alina refused parcels whose water required debt or whose fences would consume the entire year's reserve. Ruth tested each proposal against conservative sale weights and dry-year forage, not the best prices from the previous fall. Let me tell you about the 480 acres, because the number sounded larger than the financial risk Alina actually carried. By 1994, the operation controlled that acreage through a combination of the 74-acre Mercer home farm, the 160-acre Harrow pasture, a purchased 86-acre grass parcel paid for from retained earnings, and long leases totaling 160 acres. Control did not mean every acre sat beneath a mortgage. The home place had no new lien. The leases could be left at term if grass prices or herd numbers changed. The purchase parcel had closed for cash after Ruth's ledger showed the reserve would survive the payment. Each acre received a water plan before an animal entered. Some used existing tanks. Some depended on hauled water for short rotations, with the hauling cost written openly into the lease decision. None received a copy of the original collector merely because it had worked once. Elena read soil profiles, walked slopes after rain, and rejected wet spots that lacked a stable sand layer or protected recharge. The black notebook stayed in her shirt pocket, its oilcloth worn pale along the fold. It still contained the word quit beneath the first declining flow rates. She had never torn out the page. For a while, things actually seemed fine. Buyers returned, the herd grew within its grass, and Douglas's summer measurements changed only by expected drought fractions. That didn't last, because the county file left Flint County. Douglas forwarded copies of the initial proof, the 1980 drought measurement, the sanitary test, and the collector sketch to plains range and stock after an editor asked for examples of low-cost livestock water developed without drilling. He included Elena's name and nothing resembling praise. The numbers were sufficient. The publication assigned Marion Voss, a range management writer, to examine the operation. Marion arrived in Morrow Bend during October 1994, spent one afternoon walking the protected strip with Douglas, and requested the records behind every figure. Elena brought out the green ledger, the well quote, the receipts, and the county flow sheets. Last came the first notebook. In 1994, a range management writer unfolded Elena's original black notebook on the kitchen table. The oilcloth cover resisted lying flat, so a salt cellar held one corner while Francis's brass plumb bob held the other. Marion read the pages in order. The April lease arithmetic came first, followed by the clause stating, "No credit for water improvements." Then came the groundwater manual notes, the auger depths, the first wet sand at 41 inches, and the measurements from the collector that failed. Elena did not guide Marion past that section. The flow had declined because fine native sand migrated into oversized voids around the pipe, packed the coupling, and reduced intake. The first trench had also asked the perforated PVC to accept uneven soil pressure before the bedding settled. Elena's correction appeared on the next pages. She separated native sand by jar settling and screens, built a graded transition from formation material to fine washed fraction, then to middle gravel and coarse stone, and bedded the pipe so the envelope carried the load. The replacement collector delivered 2.74 gallons per minute on September 28. Marion's article opened with the failed version. That choice surprised the buyers who expected a novelty story about buffalo drinking from scrap pipe. The article treated the animals as the load the water system had to serve, not as decoration. It reproduced Elena's measured flow, the drought rate of 2.21 gallons per minute, the daily yield, the actual herd demand, and the $94.10 waterworks cost beside the $8,640 well quote. It also described the $1,606.85 required for the full startup, including lease and fencing. More important, it followed the cash. 12 bison in 1977 became 18 in 1981, 27 in 1984, 41 in 1988, and 56 in 1992 because sales and accumulated savings paid for each increase. Marion quoted no miracle and invented no percentage. She printed the receipts. The article reached grazing associations across Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Missouri. Invitations followed, first from a county pasture meeting and later from 2 regional grazing conferences. Elena accepted only when the organizers agreed that she would explain seep development rather than display buffalo as an attraction. At the first meeting, she stood beside a chalkboard in her faded olive canvas work shirt and drew the slope in section. Her collar-length chestnut-brown hair was tied low with a plain cord, and the black notebook remained in her pocket. She marked the clay cap, the sand lens, the graded filter, the perforated collector, the cleanout, the tank, and the open-air overflow. Her remarks lasted 23 minutes. "Find the water before you buy the pipe," she said. An operator asked whether any wet hillside could be developed. Elena answered no. Another asked whether gravel alone would filter the sand. Not that sand. She explained that filter materials had to bridge particle sizes gradually enough to retain the formation while passing water. Too coarse beside fine sand invited migration and plugging. Too fine throughout reduced permeability. The design had to hold soil and transmit flow at the same time. She showed the failed coupling after the meeting, still packed with the cemented sand she had removed years earlier. The invitations continued, but Alina kept them brief and technical. She showed dry season data, not only the proof day maximum. She described the fenced recharge strip before she described the tank. If someone asked how to make the system larger, she asked what their animals actually drank. A large outlet did not justify a large herd when grass could not support it. Frances attended one meeting and sat near the aisle in her brown herringbone cardigan, the brass plum bob hanging from her belt loop. She listened while Alina repeated the line from the notebook. "Count what stays, not what shines." Frances did not smile until Alina turned back to the chalkboard. By 1996, the Mercer herd reached 78 head. Gross receipts were $103,440. Ruth closed the year with sale income on one side of the green ledger and every operating cost on the other. Gross receipts did not erase hay, veterinary work, lease payments, transport, labor, tax, or replacement fencing. After those costs, the retained amount was smaller, and only that smaller amount could purchase land or animals. That discipline mattered when Leon decided to sell the 160-acre pasture. He was 80 years old, still lean, still slightly forward at the waist, but his broad steps had shortened. The brass leasebox key remained attached to his belt by its chain. He came to the Mercer kitchen with the original lease, placed it beside the black notebook, and tapped the clause Alina had read in 1977. "No credit for water improvements." "I remember," Alina said. "I do too." Leon's asking price reflected grazing land with dependable water. Alina did not request that he subtract the value she had created, and Leon did not pretend the spring had developed itself. Ruth spent 6 weeks building a purchase schedule from retained earnings, expected sales, and a reserve large enough to carry 2-week seasons. The agreement required a cash down payment and fixed installments paid directly to Leon. The Mercer home acreage did not secure the balance. If the operation failed to make the terms, the Harrow parcel alone returned to him. Frances read every page at the kitchen table. When she reached the security clause, she adjusted her dark tortoiseshell glasses. "The home farm stays out." "Yes," Ruth said. Frances passed the agreement to Alina. "Then count it." The final installment was paid from operating earnings without placing a lien on the 74 acres. Leon brought the leasebox key on the payment day. He detached the short chain from his belt and set the key beside the deed. "That box belongs to you now." Alina slid the key toward Ruth, put it with the first lease. The lease had become a deed, but the collector remained subject to measurement. Douglas returned each summer during the driest week he could reasonably identify. His sandy gray hair turned white, his deliberate heel-first walk slowed, and the steel case of his flow stopwatch accumulated scratches. The original mechanism finally began losing time during a test in 1999. Douglas repeated the run with Alina's kitchen timer, frowned at the disagreement, and unclipped the stopwatch. "Worn pivot," he said. The following week he returned with a replacement flow timer, a new graduated container, and a calibration sheet. He gave the old stopwatch to Ruth, who entered its service dates in the ledger before placing it in the lease box. Douglas used the replacement to measure the drought flow. The number remained within the established seasonal range. He never treated that stability as permission to stop checking. Clay cracked, roots grew, fittings aged, and land use above a shallow lens could change. Each summer he inspected the cap, buffer, clean-out discharge, and overflow route before timing the water. Alina did the same throughout the year. Dependable did not mean unattended. Let me tell you about Ruth's next idea, because she began with overflow everyone could already see and rainfall nobody could schedule. By the early 2000s, she managed the accounts, lease comparisons, and water records. She had preserved every dated line from the first green ledger and transferred totals into a computer without discarding the paper books. The figures showed that spring overflow exceeded herd demand through much of the year, but summer grazing still depended on where gravity could carry that water. Roofs on the equipment shed and hay barn also shed thousands of gallons during storms, most of it into bare channels. Ruth proposed catching that roof water in covered storage and combining it with spring overflow in a lower drought reserve system. The reserve would serve one paddock during short dry rotations, allowing other grass more recovery without pumping groundwater. She did not propose drilling, and she did not propose taking more from the lens. The collector would continue flowing at its natural rate. Water not immediately consumed would be stored when available. She spent 2 years recording roof areas, rainfall by storm, first flush losses, tank evaporation, herd demand, and elevation differences. She rejected her first layout because one storage site sat too high for gravity fill. The second required a buried line across a vehicle lane. The third placed covered tanks below the barn roofs and above the reserve paddock, with a separate spring overflow line entering through an air gap. Ruth priced every valve, tank, gutter, screen, pipe length, and concrete pad. She included replacement reserves and the cost of cleaning sediment from first flush chambers. She did not count a gallon until the collection efficiency had been measured during actual rain. In 2008, Ruth arrived at the spring box carrying the green ledger and a laptop. She was 49 then, still slim, with copper-red hair held back by a navy cloth band and a dense scatter of freckles across both cheeks. Her amber-framed glasses reflected the laptop screen as she set it on the inspection shelf Douglas had helped Alina build. The old green ledger rested beneath her left arm. Alina was 66. Her shoulders remained broad beneath the faded olive canvas shirt, though her chestnut-brown hair now carried gray where the plain cord held it at her neck. The crescent-shaped birthmark below her right ear showed when she bent over Ruth's first page. Let me tell you about the budget on that screen, because Ruth had built it in the same order Alina had used for the Harrow lease. Water came first. The spring's verified seasonal range established the dependable base flow. Roof catchment came second, calculated from measured roof area, recorded rainfall, runoff loss, and first flush diversion. Covered storage came third, sized to bridge dry intervals rather than capture every theoretical gallon. Herd demand came last, calculated from actual Mercer records under heat, not from a flattering average. The model separated supply by source. Spring overflow remained continuous but variable. Roof water arrived in pulses. Storage connected the two over time. Ruth had included a drought sequence based on the driest recorded months, then reduced projected inflow again to test the margin. The reserve paddock would carry a limited group for a limited number of days before rotation, never the full herd indefinitely. Her cash budget followed the same caution. Paid-for gutters and screens collected barn runoff. Covered tanks prevented livestock entry and reduced algae and evaporation. A first flush chamber discarded the dirtiest roof water at the beginning of each storm, carrying dust, bird droppings, and loose roofing grit away before cleaner runoff entered storage. Separate valves allowed either source to be isolated for inspection. Gravity delivered water to the reserve trough. There was no electric pump and no operating loan. Ruth opened the capacity sheet. The planned storage exceeded the measured reserve group demand across the chosen rotation by a margin large enough to absorb first flush loss and one missed rain. She had not credited the project with increased livestock sales. The first justification was grass protected through longer rest. Alina studied the first page. Years earlier, Frances had taken 3 days because the lease placed $1,200 and the family's limited cash against uncertain water. Ruth's proposal arrived with 2 years of measurements, a full cash reserve, and no claim against the home farm. Alina looked once at the green ledger. "Yes," she said. Ruth paused with one hand above the keyboard. "You haven't read the valves." "I will." That evening, Alina read every page. Immediate permission did not mean careless permission. It meant Ruth had already answered the question Frances once needed 3 days to settle. Construction began after the spring sale receipts cleared and the tax reserve remained intact. Ruth bought 2 covered tanks, screen gutters, first flush fittings, valves, sound pressure-rated pipe, and enough concrete material for level pads. The operation paid cash. Alina reused only materials whose condition she could verify. The remaining rejected perforated pipe stayed out of the pressurized and potable portions because it had been engineered for drainage, not sealed conveyance. Free material had a proper use, and this was not it. Frances, now 92, came to the spring on the morning they set the first tank elevation. Her short, even gait had slowed, but her posture remained upright. The iron-gray braid, nearly white, was pinned into the same low coil. She removed the brass plumb bob from her belt and handed it to Alina. "Your line," she said. Alina hung the bob from the tank frame, waited for the brass point to settle, and marked the true vertical. When the pads cured and the storage tank stood level, she carried the plumb bob to Ruth. Ruth closed the laptop. Alina placed the brass weight in her palm. "Count what stays, not what shines." Ruth curled her fingers around the line. I know you do." The drought reserve system did not enter the ledger as a success when the last valve was tightened. It entered as construction cost. Ruth recorded tank capacity from measured dimensions, then compared that figure with metered fill. She diverted the first spring overflow through the new line, checked every joint, and found a slow leak at a threaded valve below the western tank. The loss amounted to less than a gallon in an hour, but over a dry month it would have wasted hundreds. She drained the section, replaced the damaged seat, and tested again. The first substantial rain exposed another failure. One first flush chamber emptied too slowly, therefore dirty initial runoff remained in the chamber when cleaner roof water arrived. The chamber overtopped towards storage before it had shed the designed volume. Ruth measured the outlet, removed an undersized restriction, and fitted a larger drain with a service screen that could be cleaned from ground level. Only after 3 storms produced clear stored water beyond the first flush did she count the roof collection efficiency. It came in below the paper estimate because wind carried part of the rainfall past the gutter edge. She changed the model to the measured figure. The tanks did not become larger because she wanted them to. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The reserve trough filled by gravity, the spring collector continued flowing undisturbed, and the green ledger received neat test entries. That didn't last. A dry cycle began the following summer, reducing rainfall and forcing the reserve design to perform under the condition that had justified its cost. Ruth assigned 22 bison to the reserve paddock for a controlled period. She measured storage before entry, trough draw each morning, evaporation and spring overflow admitted to the tanks. Grass in the adjoining paddocks received additional recovery days because those animals were not returned early. The roof tanks received no helpful storm during the first half of the test. Storage fell exactly as the demand model predicted within the ordinary variation caused by heat. The gravity line maintained trough depth. The spring overflow replaced part of the daily use without changing the collector's measured discharge. When a storm finally arrived, the first flush chambers diverted dirty runoff. The tanks refilled below their vent lines, and excess water passed safely to the lower pond. Douglas attended the final measurement with his replacement timer. He was 85, leaner than before, still holding his shoulders back while he walked heel first toward the outlet. Ruth gave him the graduated container. Elena opened the test diversion. The collector remained within its established dry season range. Douglas looked from the old cleanout riser to the covered tanks below the barn roofs. "Separate systems," he said. "Yes," Ruth replied. "Good." The measured dry cycle closed without hauling water, pumping groundwater, damaging the spring buffer, or grazing the reserve paddock below Elena's minimum stubble height. Ruth entered the verified gallons, protected grazing days, construction cost, maintenance cost, and hay deferred. Only then did she draw a line beneath the project and add it to the purchasing rule as proven capacity. The green ledger had begun as a record of fuel not burned by one tractor wagon. It now governed land, storage, fencing, breeding purchases, and dry year reserves. The original volume remained in the lease box beside Douglas's worn stopwatch, Leon's first lease, the final deed receipt, and the cracked coupling from Elena's failed collector. Frances died several winters later at 96, after a short illness, with the Mercer home farm still free of the debt she had refused to risk in 1977. Her brass plumb bob remained in daily use. Ruth carried it in the green ledger's canvas case and used it whenever a tank pad, gate post, or collector riser needed a true line. Elena never hung it as decoration. Let me tell you about the operation in 2025, because the large figures only make sense when placed beside the original 12 animals and 96 feet of rejected pipe. Mercer Buffalo Company ran 186 bison on 1,120 acres. The acreage included the original 74-acre home farm, the purchased Harrow pasture, additional cash-bought grass, and long leases chosen under the same dry year tests Ruth had applied for decades. Some parcels used wells already present. Some used ponds protected by fencing and hardened approaches. 2 used developed seeps built only after soil profiles and seasonal measurements supported them. None copied the Harrow collector blindly. Gross receipts in 2025 were $648,370. Ruth's account still separated that figure from earnings. Feed, pasture rent, land payments, veterinary care, processing, transport, fencing, insurance, taxes, and labor came out before expansion. The company carried operating reserves in cash and held no mortgage against the Mercer home acreage. Alina was 83. Her long, measured steps had shortened, but she still stood squarely at the spring gate, thin silver wire-rimmed glasses resting above freckles across her nose. Her black oilcloth notebook no longer stayed in her shirt pocket every day because the binding had begun to separate. It remained in the lease box and came out for summer flow checks. Ruth was 67 and managed the company books, water models, and pasture agreements. The green ledger had expanded into shelves of paper records and mirrored computer files, but she still carried the first volume to major decisions. A younger Mercer relative, an adult niece named Claire, joined the operation with a notebook of her own and a proposal to map grazing recovery against soil moisture. She laid out the sensors, cash cost, replacement schedule, and the question each measurement would answer. Ruth read the first page. Alina watched from across the table. "Will it borrow against anything?" Ruth asked. "No." "Will the numbers change a grazing decision?" "Yes." Ruth looked toward Alina. Alina nodded once. "Do it," Ruth said. Outside, the original failed pond remained shallow. Grass covered the bypass swale. The protected recharge strip held firm beneath woven wire that had been replaced several times, always along Douglas's flagged boundary. The galvanized stock tank had finally worn through and been retired, but its replacement stood at the same elevation, receiving the same clear outlet through open air. Below it, overflow continued toward the lower pond. The collector itself had required new couplings, a clean-out repair, and fresh gravel at the exposed outlet across 48 years. The buried perforated barrel remained in service because the cracked bell ends had been removed before installation, the graded envelope had prevented sand migration, and the surrounding soil carried the load. Flint Tileworks had once paid 12 cents per foot to discard that pipe. Nothing about its price had determined its function. On the final dry season check of August 2025, Ruth opened Douglas's calibration sheet while Claire held the graduated container. Alina stood outside the fence with the black notebook in both hands. The flow was lower than the September 1977 proof and consistent with the collector's long drought record. Clear water entered the tank. The bison drank and moved back toward the grass. The tank recovered. Alina opened the notebook to the first page. The lease figures were faded but readable. Annual lease $1,200, fencing $312, auger $18, shovel $4, gravel $34.50. Couplings $9.60, tank $28, notebook 75 cents, total startup $1,606.85. Farther back, the word quit remained crossed out beside the falling flow from the failed collector. The next pages held the graded filter and the proof rate. After that came the drought rate. Nothing had been removed to make the story cleaner. Alina handed the notebook to Claire. "Start with what stays," she said. Claire tucked it beneath one arm and closed the spring gate. The 74-acre home farm remained in the Mercer name. The 160-acre lease was recorded as Mercer land. Douglas's replacement timer rested in the county office after his retirement beside a copy of the first verified flow sheet. Leon's leasebox key still opened the metal box in the kitchen cabinet. Ruth's green ledger remained current through the last completed sale. 12 buffalo dug. Alina measured. The first pipe failed. The spring held. The lease became a deed. The spring still runs beneath the old Harrow pasture.